interviewing the leading private equity executives and unlocking the secrets of success. Welcome to the Private Equity Podcast with Alex Rawlings.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Private Equity Podcast. Joining us today is Paul Doyle, the managing partner of Blackford Capital. Welcome, Paul, and thank you very much for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Alex. It's great to be with you this morning.
Absolutely. So as always, Paul, I'd like to kick off. If you could share kind of a 60 to 90 second breakdown of you and the firm, please.
Certainly. I would begin by telling you I'm the most surprised person to be working in private equity of anyone who's probably listening. My background started at the University of Notre Dame, where I received two things: a great academic foundation, but also was involved in competitive athletics, which was important to my future in a way that I didn't know, because I had always thought that I would wind up being an athletic coach. Was the concept that I had thought about for my career in the very beginning. And little did I realize then how much coaching was a critical part of my professional development along the way. When I got out of college, I actually started at a consulting firm in Portland, Oregon, working with a responsibility for developing first-line supervisors in manufacturing settings, and probably spent time with 350 or 400 first-line supervisors over a 4-year career, learning a great deal about business from the very bottom. One of my clients hired me to come in and work on operations. A client, a tier 1 automotive company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I had an opportunity to start to learn about the broader business responsibilities. And ultimately, they wound up asking me to be responsible for strategic planning for 34 global locations and the executive talent assessment and selection processes, which is probably the two core things that have become part of my career ever since. I went from there into another tier 1 automotive company in Grand Haven, Michigan, as head of sales and marketing, where they were interested in making a transformation from being a stamping company to a high-end mechatronics company, which was a fascinating transition to meander our way through from the standpoint of talent and strategy and customers and competencies and processes. But along the way, through that transition, I think a lot of my experience around strategy and executive team development was put to play, and they wound up asking me to serve as the chief executive officer. The timing was horrible, and that was the beginning of the Great Recession. So while nobody's well prepared to be CEO in their first role, having that opportunity at the beginning of the Great Recession in the automotive industry was a kind of a 3 strikes kind of a deal. But during that period of time, again, I learned an awful lot about the importance of executive teams and the ability to work on kind of a defining purpose and process for an organization. And we managed to grow the business from about 77 million in sales to about 450 million in sales, probably created close to $500 million in value during that 7-year run that I was CEO there. I then had a friend who owned 5 businesses in Holland, Michigan, and he asked me to come down because he wanted to spend more time on the beach with his wife and less time running his businesses. So I came down to help him. We quickly realized 3 of the businesses were hobbies that had gone wrong. We closed them, and we focused on the remaining 2 businesses. One was another tier 1 automotive company, worked in the safety space, and the other was a packaging supply company. Those were both great opportunities. We ran those up in probably in about a 6 or 7 year period, created about 100 million in value during that period of time. During that period of time, I'd also met Martin Stein, who was the founder of Blackford Capital, and began working with him as an operating partner, focusing on helping him with planning for Blackford, but also planning in the portfolio companies and executive work, coaching CEOs in the portfolio companies. About 6 months ago, he asked me to make the permanent move from industry into private equity, and that's when I assumed the role of managing partner at Blackford, and have been working inside the firm since that period of time. And somewhere in the middle of there, we also started a consulting firm called LeaderWork, which was a firm focused exclusively on developing the skills of leading. And we've probably run 400 local leaders through that program. It's a year-long program, basically preparing people for what leaders do, not the style or the swagger or the personality type, but the actual tasks of leading. And that's been fairly successful as well. So that brings me to today.
Very good. Certainly appreciate the insight and the differences from operations to then moving into sales and then into chief executive leadership, but certainly not the time anybody would want their first gig as a CEO when a recession hits. But we learn our most through the toughest times. So I'm sure you got a lot of value from that, and the growth of that business that you mentioned as well, from 40 odds millions to 400s is a very impressive, certainly a very impressive growth. So having been on both sides, Paul, what one mistake do you see either private equity firms or portfolio companies making, and what actions would you take, I suppose, to correct them?
Yeah, having spent 8 years as an operating partner and now only maybe 6 months as the managing partner, I would qualify my remarks to say that I haven't seen the thousands of private equity firms, but I have seen a good number of them. And I think that the people I've run into in private equity, and certainly the people at Blackford, incredibly smart people, most of them coming out of the finance and accounting kind of worlds. And I guess the one thing that I think that we have tried to do here, and I believe is an important complement to the talents around understanding the numbers and the financial models and things like that, is the appropriate involvement of operational assessments in due diligence. When you look at why a company is performing or not performing, you can create financial models, you can understand the market, you can see the potential based upon kind of the assessments that are done. But the best laid plans will not become anything if not executed upon, and if not led by effective teams. So what we have tried to do, and what I think is a really kind of a cool strategy, is we developed a suite of operating partners, people who have spent time in industry in certain areas. Some of them are salespeople, some of them are growth leaders, some of them are operational people, some are finance, some are product development. And we involve them to a great extent in the diligence phase, where we ask them to go in and assess two things. One is the health of the core processes that drive whatever that element is. So if it's a product development person, let's talk about the phase gates and the milestones and disciplines and the reviews and things like that. So we ask them to assess the health of the process, but we'll also ask them to assess the talent that is resident in those jobs. And so as we look to decide about an acquisition or not, we go in with eyes wide open about the ability of the firm to achieve the financial models or the market models that we think are through analysis possible, and then decide, all right, so what do we need to do to make certain that we have the enhancements to the processes or the development of the people necessary to achieve those objectives. We enhance that by, while they're involved in the diligence phase, we've also established a process whereby the operating partners who do the due diligence are asked to serve in board roles for the first 4 months of the ownership of a new portfolio company, for the purpose of handing off their diligence to the operating team that's going to run the business. So whether we maintain the executive team that currently in place or bring in some talent we think is necessary to augment it, the people who have done the assessment, the people who have done the deep dive into what's working and not working, are the best people to help that new management team set priorities and understand where their strengths. They can continue in that role, in a consulting sort of role as an operating partner if necessary, but at least the handoff occurs in the immediate post-transition ownership phase. And then we can establish boards and proper governance from Blackford to support those as well. So I think that's a really critical piece in the value creation puzzle, is how do you understand process capability, and then how do you support it once you get it going?
That's really interesting. And I know I've spoken about this before, but that operating partner model and the structure around it and the actual value creation piece is an area that is being adopted more and more by large, small private equity firms. It's happening a lot more in North America than currently it's happening in Europe. We're seeing businesses now start to have it, and we're kind of adopting the title of portfolio director in Europe. But operating partner, certainly a key critical role, and just fills that gap between, as you mentioned, being in finance, getting your degree, working through, looking what businesses do, understanding what a good P&L looks like and seeing the finances of a company, but that operating role of actually knowing and understanding that, having been there, done that in the most part for those types of roles is proving absolutely critical. And we've seen a lot of private equity firms making that move to that model. And I love the amount of structure that you have around that, Paul, to build that out.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about that is that the people we're finding who want to participate in these roles are oftentimes people who are recently retired from full-time roles, but aren't ready just to sit on a beach for the rest of their lives. They're probably at the top of their game. And everybody who gets to some sort of an executive level at the right organization, they normally have an area that is their normal narrow focus. They may augment that with more general management responsibilities, but there's usually something that they're really super passionate about, and they've made a real career of. They understand a certain process at a depth that others may not, and they're looking for an opportunity not to go through all the grind of making that work, but by leveraging their wisdom and by leveraging their experience and coaching up the next generation. And there's a large group of people who I think really look at that as an opportunity to contribute, and they make great operating partners because they come in with bright eyes and they come in with energy, and they know they don't have to go through the grind. They can just be the coach, and I think it works in a lot of levels.
They can impart wisdom as opposed to turning the screws themselves. And gaining that experience and that knowledge is critical. And it's that ability for then your portfolio executives to be able to make quicker decisions, more accurate decisions based on previous experience that they may not have had, that they can leverage, which is invaluable for any exec to be able to do things faster.
My father always told me when I was growing up, he said, "Hey, listen, I've already made that mistake. Why don't you make a new one?"
Absolutely. And definitely the case. So you mentioned obviously about that leadership style and your investment that you've put into obviously building that company and putting various things, 400 plus leaders through that process. And I know from obviously this podcast discussions about your passion for leadership and your study of it. So I know that you've studied a lot about leadership and read a lot of books about them. So what are your kind of top 4 recommendations for books on leadership, Paul?
It's a great question. And there's been a lot of great thinking about leadership and a lot of great books that have been written by people. And earlier in my career, I think I probably tried to make an effort to read them all. But at the end of the day, I would tell you that there are 4 books that I would recommend to any executive. And these are books that I think get at the core principles of 4 important parts of leading. I think you could go into any bookstore and there's 5,000 books on leadership, but the 4 that I would tell you kind of I think hit the basic principles fall into 4 categories, and that's management strategy, people, and kind of the concept of servant leadership. So the first book that I would recommend was written in 1974 by Peter Drucker, who a lot of people consider the father of professional management. He wrote a book called Management Task Practices and Accountabilities. And it's not a book that you want to read kind of cover to cover like a novel. It's more like it's an encyclopedia, and you want it as a reference guide on your shelf. And when you have a problem, you can go to the index and he'll have some sort of wisdom that teaches you what the right questions to ask are around those topics. And the scope of what that book covers in terms of management is fairly, it's exceedingly comprehensive. It's management is distinct from concepts of leadership. It's the best book out there. The second book on strategy, I would argue that while there's a lot of people, and I've read Porter's stuff on 5 factors, and I've read Blue Ocean Strategies and all those sort of things. Those are all good structures to think about, but the principles, again, of strategy, I would go back to a really old book, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, by Sun Tzu. He was a Chinese general in the Chinese Warring States period. A really interesting take on the book was translated by a guy by the name of Gary Gagliardi, where what he did is he took the book, which is, if you read it, it's almost like reading poetry. It's written in stanzas, and he's taken those stanzas and translated those into the kind of the industrial or business kind of application of it. So rather than trying to read it and trying to discern it from a kind of the original Chinese language, he's done a really nice translation. And there's 13 different segments in the book on the elements of strategy, and there's 127 subpoints on strategic elements, and you certainly aren't going to know them all, but when you start thinking about competition or information or executive choices or things like that, all that content is really, again, at the principle level, is really well covered in that book. The third concept, I guess, is the one of people, and there's an awful lot of good work being done on people and their connection and engagement at work. But I don't think anybody's done it any better than Abraham Maslow. In the early days of psychology study, Abraham Maslow was the first psychologist actually to study healthy people rather than unhealthy people. And so I've always appreciated that kind of take on where he developed his theories from. But his concepts of that people go through certain stages of basic needs, then safety needs, then social needs, then self-esteem needs, then self-actualization. If you really understand kind of the core of that, then you'll really understand really all you need to know about people at work. He had an experience where he was asked to take his theories and come and spend time with a company out in California and make this adaptation between the psychology and business and how did it apply. And it wound up being ultimately written in a book called Maslow on Management, and all of the unique aspects of management and people and his concepts of how do you help people become more of what they're capable of becoming. That's a great book to get you everything you need to know about the psychology side of people. We don't need business owners being shrinks, but we do need to recognize that at the end of the day, work gets done by and through people. And so an understanding of what drives them is important. So I put that on the short list. And then the last one is Robert Greenleaf's work on servant leadership. And again, there's all sorts of kind of takes and cuts on what makes an effective leader. But I think his book on kind of the pillars of how do you serve others have been time and time again been shown to outperform companies where perhaps positional authority is the power structure in an organization. I've got a bigger business card than you, so you have to do what I say. Greenleaf would tell you that things around empathy and listening and awareness and team building and those sorts of things, those will get greater engagement and greater results out of people. And I think there's even been work done that says if you took the last 50 years of kind of performance in the stock market and looked at the average performing company and then compared that to companies that followed the good to great principles, they might be, maybe 10% outperforming the norm. And then if you were to take companies that would meet Greenleaf's idea of the servant-led leadership, they outperform the good to great by another 15 to 20%. So there's real economic kind of results associated with this. This isn't a kind of a kumbaya, let's hug everybody. It's one of those truisms that we can serve both people and business at the same time. And I think Greenleaf did as good a job as anybody at making that point. So those would probably be the four books: Drucker, Sun Tzu, Maslow on Management, and then Greenleaf on servant leadership.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the further insight and the reasons why there. So, and I know from offline discussions how much of various different books that you've read and anything you can get your hands on with regards to leadership and management. So those are definitely very good tips. It's interesting to hear, Peter Drucker, one of the guys, actually walked into the office today and showed me a book from him, and it's something you read a page every day. And I apologize, I don't know the name, but he's marked the cover and had to throw it away, so it just looks like a Bible of what it was, but it's clearly an old book. Every day you read something and it's all on theory of leadership, management, business. So yeah, amazing that those old books still stand strong, and the fundamentals of what can come in, servant leadership being that, I always imagine the triangle being, instead of the point or the top point, it has to be at the bottom, and the management and leadership is there to serve other people in the business for them to be able to be more effective from there. So some really good stuff in there, and we'll put those books names in the show notes for anybody who's driving and hasn't had the opportunity to write them down, so don't crash your car. Sorry to interrupt here, just a quick note to highlight our new sponsor, Grata. The private equity market is rapidly shifting to a data-driven, proprietary deal sourcing standard. Grata provides the window into over 7 million middle market private companies. Contact Grata so you can access the market first. Request a demo at www.grata.com. Now back to the podcast. So based on that reading, based on your own experience of growing, developing businesses, based on your now experience or 6 months experience of being within an actual private equity firm, as opposed to, leading the helm of a portfolio business, what have been your kind of top takeaways, top recommendations for portfolio leaders within the private equity industry, for them to, based on your experience, for them to be better and for them to improve?
Yeah, I don't think anything prepares somebody to be the CEO of a company for the first time. Pardon me. There is no role inside the company that is akin to being the CEO. And I think there's two big pieces to that. One is that on one level, the CEO's role is to connect the company to the outside world, right? While if you came up through sales, marketing, finance, operations, product development, you've got a very internal focus. You've got a responsibility to build the processes and competencies to perform in that area. But the CEO role is unique in that it has to focus on being the bridge to the outside world. Someone has to be the bridge to the market, to the lenders, to the customers, to the suppliers. And those things exist outside the organization. And that is a very unique kind of position that there's no prep for that in a current role. And so part of the, I think the need in that area is for things around mentors and people who can help the CEO kind of begin to develop that experience of how to connect the outside to the inside. But then when you then turn to the inside, I think there's probably 4 things that I would say are my big takeaways from the 15 years I've spent in the CEO role. The first one is it is imperative that you build a team at the top. Not that you try to exist as a CEO giving individual direction, kind of to a group of people. The businesses in today's world are too complicated for an individual to run them alone. The interrelationships between departments and things are imperative if you want to get both the operational effectiveness and efficiency really needed to perform. And so spending time legitimately building the executive team is imperative. Teamwork in the organization, throughout the organization, will never exceed the teamwork that exists at the top of the organization. When people look at the top of the organization, they're going to try to decide, is this group a group I can trust? Is this a group who's going to build a strategy that's going to create opportunity for me? Customers are going to be making that same decision. And when they see a truly aligned executive team at the top of the organization, it builds confidence. So I would tell you the number one thing is to build that that team at the top. one way of saying that, which is kind of an interesting one, is there was a rather significant study done probably 15 or 20 years ago on what makes great teams, and particularly what makes great teams at the top of institutions. And they studied some of the truly high performing teams of all time and tried to break them down into what were the true drivers of it. And one of the most interesting things that they found in the course of this study was that all the great teams had reunions. And it was a puzzler for the research people about, well, what is that all about? I mean, why would that be a common element among great teams? And when they dug into it, what they found was that the thing that truly defined a high performing team was not the relationship between the executive and the team members, but ultimately it was the relationship of the members to each other. When they started to care about each other, when they started to communicate effectively with each other, when they started to support and partner with each other, that's when true teams started to outperform. Well, the great teams started to outperform the very good teams. And on the basis of that member to member relationship, a bond was established that superseded the purpose and objective of the team. And when that work was done, the relationship still existed. And so they had reunions. And so their purpose was never to have reunions, but because of the relationship they built, it was a natural thing for them to do. And that has always been a reminder to me that when I think of my role as the executive, it's not to build great relationships with the people who report to me, but to make certain that they're building great relationships between each other as well. I would tell you that my time at one of my companies, GHSP, we had a global organization, and there were probably 17 people that I would put at the top level of the organization. That group became a phenomenal team, and that was the group that went from 77 to 450 million. And I'll tell you, it was based upon that kind of connection they had to one another. They worked together as well as any company I've seen. The second point I would say is that while you've got a team, they do need to understand what it is that they're there to do. And so giving them a clear purpose statement is an important thing. And purpose is the why they exist, not the what they exist, right? It's the bumper sticker of 20 words that says, here's how this team creates value in the organization. And the reason that purpose it's so important is that if you give people a list of objectives or a list of key measures, they can be compliant with those and get those done. But that doesn't open the door for creativity nor initiative. When people understand where the mountaintop is, what the purpose is, then in addition to completing the tasks that you might think are important on a daily or weekly or annual basis, they can also say, hey, if this is our purpose, then what about this? And I've seen that's where real innovation and initiative comes from, is from the purpose, and people understanding the purpose of their team. The third thing then I would say is that it's important that the team understand what its processes are and its metrics are. You know, how do we get our work done, and how do we know if we're winning or losing? If we haven't defined those things, created objective standards for the processes, you're going to wind up randomly working really, really hard, but maybe or maybe not achieving the results you want. And so I think the guardrails that are put up around a team in support of a purpose, from the standpoint of understanding, here are the 3 or 4 key processes that drive our work, and here's how we know whether or not we're winning or losing, absolutely critical for success. And then the last one I would say is kind of a lesson learned the hard way, is the idea of focus. You can't give people too many things to work on. We wind up saying, here's your list of 27 initiatives we want you to complete in the next year. It's not going to get it done, right? Give them the 3 that matter and let them knock those out of the park. One of the phrases that we used to use in companies that I've run was, Rome wasn't built in a day, but they worked on it every day. And so just understanding what are the 2 or 3 things that really are going to move the needle, you'll make a lot better progress than trying to overwhelm people with a ton of initiatives. So build a team, give them purpose, know your processes, and focus on critical results.
Sounds like certainly a very good plan, and very structured as well, Paul. I appreciate that breakdown. So obviously, I'm curious, Paul, with the amount of studies that you've done, to hear this. It's a question we ask every guest, but what 3 attributes do you believe make a top performer?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think every time you're going through a recruiting process or a selection process or things like that, that really becomes the critical question. If I was thinking about executive teams in particular, Alex, I guess I'd say three attributes. This goes back to, and I'm sure everybody's got their own list, so I'm not trying to say that I've got the right list, but I'll tell you what I think about. I grew up in competitive athletics, and I like people who have been in competitive environments. Not just athletics, but my daughter was in competitive theater. My son competes in a kind of one of these three-dimensional board games called Warhammer, right? And the idea of kind of the competitive grit, the people who are prepared to know how to work hard to get something. And competing isn't about beating somebody else. Competing is about the constant pursuit of trying to become as good as you can possibly get at the gifts that you were given. I like that as an attribute of a high performer, as somebody who has been through some sort of a competitive experience and has really learned how to work hard. That's something I look for. The second one, I would tell you, it would probably be something around humility. There was a phrase I heard once that I've always liked in this idea of humility, is that I like people who say, they're prepared to slam their fist on the table and say, this is exactly what I believe, but I could be wrong. And both of those halves of that statement are important. I like the confidence that goes with saying, hey, I've worked hard to learn what I know, and I'm going to operate on all of that. But I'm always going to stay open to influence. I'm always going to stay open to the possibility that there's a new way of looking at things, or a new way of performing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of a humility that I'd like to see in an executive, that both halves of that statement, this is exactly what I believe. I like that confidence, but I could be wrong. I like that openness to influence. And the third one goes back to one of the books that we talked about, and that's the idea of service to team. When you truly recognize that it's the team that's going to get things done, not you as an individual contributor, then your job is to make it easier for the team to succeed than to fail. And every day you got to come into work thinking not about your to-do list, but you've got to ask yourself questions about what's the team going to need to perform today, whether it's tools or information or process clarity or resources or whatever it is. That idea of coming to work thinking about how do you set up others for success, not just yourself, I think that's a really critical attribute. So those are probably the three. I think competitive grit, humility, and service are key attributes. A lot of the other content specific stuff, to be honest, that can be learned. But those seem to be kind of core value or intrinsic attributes that I like to look for.
Yeah, I like that. I don't know whether this is true or not, because it's not a first time story, but I heard a story once that for those who know football, or soccer as it will be referred to, your side of the pond, there's a guy, depending on who you regard as the best in the world, is either Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi. And Ronaldo, when he was at Manchester United, they got a ping pong table, and he lost pretty much against everyone. He'd never played ping pong before. And I said, I don't know if this is true, but within 2 weeks, he was the best. It wasn't because he needed to beat everyone. He just needs to be the best at everything he does. Some people get consumed by that and it can be negative, but, I appreciate that mentality of wanting to win. Something we say here internally in the business is that winners win. And it's not that you have to win on everything. It's just that you have to continually work out how to be better. And whether that's going out bowling or playing pool or ping pong or whatever it else, it's that mentality of, could I be better? Can I be better? And that striving towards that. And that balanced with your second point on humility is that ability to then also not have that consume what you're doing, of that wanting to win, but also, when you're playing pool against someone else and they're going to do a shot wrong, and it might mean that you lose the game, but telling them how to do it is the right thing to do, rather than hoping that they miss and then you winning the game, because at the end of the day, unless there's a load of money riding on it, it's fairly irrelevant whether you win or lose. It's all down to our own egos. So I love that kind of that story just came to my mind when you were talking about that. And I don't know if it's true, but I think I heard it from one of the guys at Man United that did a podcast or something on it. But I think, definitely a really fascinating point.
Let's not let the facts get in the way of a good story. It's
absolutely. Point. Who knows if it's embellished? He probably never even played ping pong and never won, but it was definitely a good story from that perspective. So, Paul, again, having worked on both sides of the table from a private equity and portfolio side, grown privately owned businesses, and obviously had some phenomenal success as a CEO even during difficult times. What do you love about the private equity industry, and also what do you dislike about it?
Yeah. I would continue to tell you that I'm relatively new to the private equity side, but there are some pieces that I like it that I really appreciate about it. Then it falls into two categories. The first one is kind of on the professional side. I love the speed of private equity. Things move fast, and you're playing with smart people. And everybody, when you can get all the kind of the alignment on the kind of similar objectives, a lot can get done in a short period of time. And that's a great feeling to accomplish things. I feel like over a 35-year career in industry with a variety of leadership opportunities, from the time I spent with the first line supervisors all the way up to my time as a CEO, I feel like I was incredibly lucky to be around and have those opportunities, and I developed a certain skill set around strategy and leaders and leadership. And I love the fact that I get to do that with 12 portfolio companies as well as Blackford. I love the ability to spread that and work with a bunch of leadership teams. That's the coaching part that I think goes back to my very early days. I really enjoy that. And I enjoyed working with one or two companies at a time, but this is an opportunity to work with many, and I like that. The other thing I like about private equity to a great extent, and this is particularly true at Blackford, is what they're doing for society. I guess I view the world as kind of broken down into a whole bunch of institutions who are constructed for the purpose of kind of making the world a better place. And the economic engine to a great portion of our world is the performance of our businesses, right? And so when businesses perform well, then that's good for owners, that's good for customers, that's good for employees, that's good for the community, that's good for the supply base. And so the opportunity to come in and work with companies, and Blackford specializes in small to middle-sized kind of manufacturing, basically manufacturing sorts of companies, to be able to come in and take companies that are performing to some level and improve their ability to perform. In some level, that's satisfying, because if we can help them perform, then they're performing better for those 5 stakeholders that I just mentioned. And when those are doing well, then the communities that they're around are doing well. And there's a real virtuous cycle up of things going right. When the economic engine is working well in society, I think a lot of things are also going to go well in society. And so the fact that we're working with 12 or 13 portfolio companies at any time to make them better economic engines in society, I love that. That's a great feeling of satisfaction of contributing and doing something that matters.
Excellent. So I'm not going to let you get away. What do you dislike about it? I'll avoid
what
it.
If I said it's exactly the
We'll
inverse?
avoid it with 2 positives.
There are times when the speed is overwhelming. There's times when the speed, at times I feel like, it's really hard to do the quality of work given the quantity of work. That's a piece that you have to balance between choices you make and resources that are available. That's a fine line to walk. And there's, anybody, I guess, who's been in private equity knows that the 40-hour work week means Tuesday. It's not a thing. It's, if you get in this game, there's a lot of work to be done. And that's the nature of the beast. The other thing I would tell you that maybe is a piece that is not my favorite is when the value set gets misaligned. when there are people who are out for individual issues, not for the greater good. I think you underperform when you do that, and you set up tensions. Well, you think about that as an individual department that's trying to optimize, over the rest of the company, an individual person who's trying to aggrandize over others. When value sets don't align, on interests around what we're trying to get done and how we're trying to get it done. That simply may be true of any institution, but the speed at which things happen here maybe amplify that a bit. So I struggled with that a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with both points. I think any business that wants to grow fast, and certainly private equity is certainly that. Obviously, will come across its challenges and its obvious workload. Which if you're getting in private equity to work less, you're probably certainly in the wrong game. Up there with lawyers and investment bankers to a certain extent. That's definitely a key area within private equity. So you've already mentioned, usual question here, Paul, is what are your influences? Now, you've already mentioned your 4 top books. So is there any other books that you would highly recommend that people read, or is there other areas that you get your information from, you watch, you listen to at all?
Well, obviously, the private equity podcast is like top of the line, right?
Well, I've heard it's great. I've heard it's really good. The presenter is incredible as well. But I mean, yeah, absolutely.
It's been an interesting thing because I have read a lot, and I used to watch news channels and things like that. But honestly, I would tell you in the last probably 2.5 years, I've turned off a lot of the normal news sources, and there's probably 2 places that I go for kind of things to stimulate my thoughts. One is I read the Wall Street Journal. I think that they stay on top of a lot of the trends. And if you just watch it day over day, you can begin to get a good sense of kind of where things are going and little tidbits of data that give you things to think about, or data for planning in your SWOT analysis. So I'm pretty disciplined about getting through the certain sections of the journal. The other one that I like to read, honestly, is the Harvard Business Review. Comes out on a quarterly basis, and they usually work around certain themes. And it's just, that's an often enough kind of refueling of the things that, here's what new people are thinking. Here's some thoughts. Here's some cuts on things. The most recent one they had out was all on purpose, the purpose of companies, and how does purpose get served up, and how does it connect to strategy, and how do you link boards to purpose, and how do you link executive teams to purpose, and things like that. And so they take these little slices and just give you good things to think about. The people that I work with will tell you that it's a curse to them, because what I do is I read the article, and then I'll tear 5 or 6 of them out, and then require everyone to read them so that we can talk about them at the next management team meeting. So they get their assigned reading, from this probably goes back to my education days, but I think constructing those kind of just regular conversations, you got to keep the saw sharp, and you got to keep people thinking about what's new and what's next. And I think that magazine does a great job of giving you good food for thought.
That's really good. And interesting you say about the lack of news. Something I've just completely switched off from. I don't follow any news outlet, to the point it was only 3 days later that I knew that obviously Russia had done what it's doing to Ukraine. It was my missus that said, "Oh, it's terrible what's happening in Ukraine." I said, "Well, they're only piling troops on the border." And she was like, "Alex, they invaded 3 days ago." And I was like, "Oh, right. Okay." And obviously nobody told me that. I think it's well worth keeping away from that stuff and just immersing yourself in things that will serve you and will serve a purpose. I'm not saying being completely dumbfounded to economic issues and local issues, but certainly getting away from the negativity of the mainstream media. If you want to position them as a devil, I definitely agree with that.
I don't know that I'd go as far as devil, but I see more agenda and narrative than what I would consider objective news. And I know that there are people who need to understand in great depth what's happening in the Ukraine, and absolutely. I'm confident that those people have that data and are working on it. My part of the world to work on, I learned a long time ago, it's better to light one candle than curse the darkness. So I focus on what it's going to take to create value in our portfolio companies. And so that's where I go for the things I want to learn about these days. And that's my way of contributing. It's my piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely, it's no point trying to influence world politics from the seats that we sit in. I'm not sure we'll do too well. Well, Paul, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate your insight. You've left us with lots of book recommendations, explanations of those books, and a really good discussion on leadership, which is a highly passionate area. And I aspire to have read as many books, certainly, or maybe half of the books that you've read on the topic to learn about. So thank you very much for sharing that, and I really appreciate you giving us all this insight.
My pleasure. It's been a great time. Thank you.
And as always, for those joining us and listening in today, thank you very much. Should you ever need support, either with private equity professionals or portfolio executive hiring, please do reach out to me at Raw Selection. But till the next time, keep smashing it. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Private Equity Podcast on www.raw-selection.com.